What's going on, guys? It's the Unhinged Engineer here. Today, I'm excited to share with you some of my perspectives on a very, very controversial topic, and that topic is vibe coding. So there's lots of different definitions of vibe coding, and lots of different people have lots of different moral opinions about whether or not vibe coding is good, whether or not it's good for your career, whether or not it's good for your employer. Vibe coding has become this hot button topic over the last, I want to say less than a year, but I'm not actually certain. It feels like just yesterday that vibe coding became as mainstream as it is now. Now, I don't want to get into all the formalities of it. I really just want to talk about my perspective as kind of a hard tech engineer. I work in the aerospace and defense industry, but I do write code primarily as my job. Like, I produce software for my employer. And so as somebody in this position, as opposed to like a software engineer at Anthropic who's probably drank all the Kool-Aid at this point, my perspective on it, I think, is a little bit different. And given that each of us at the end of the day are going to have our own opinions about when we should or should not use tools like LLMs to achieve certain ends, I just wanted to honestly throw my hat in the ring and say this is the manner in which I use it. Whether or not it's right or wrong, I'll leave for you guys to determine. And I just wanted to share my thoughts on vibe coding with you guys today, because they're a little complicated. I have mixed feelings about it, as you'll see throughout this video. But yeah, before we get into the topic at hand, I'm the Unhinged Engineer. I make professional development content for young engineers like myself. Like I said, I work in the aerospace and defense industry, but I also really like coding. I like AI, ML. I have a little bit of experience in all these things. And so if you're interested in any of that content, especially from a young person just starting off their career like myself, definitely like, comment, subscribe. Also, I'm vlogging my grad school journey. I go to Georgia Tech part-time while I continue to work full-time. And if that interests you as well, definitely like, comment, subscribe. But without further ado, let's get right into my complicated thoughts on vibe coding. To define vibe coding for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to use the definition I actually pulled from Wikipedia, which is effectively AI-assisted software development. This term was coined by Andrej Karpathy, who I am an absolutely huge fan of. He was head of AI at Tesla for many years. He also worked at Google DeepMind. He's made lots of really interesting contributions to the state of the art, both technically and kind of less technically, like vibe coding, as we'll be discussing today. I'm a really big fan of his. So he coined this term pretty recently, and he explicitly defines it as kind of coding through the vibes you're getting from an LLM, right? Like, you're avoiding explicit examination of the code. So the more you're looking at the code that you're actually trying to produce, as opposed to looking at prompts and responses from some kind of LLM, the less you're actually vibe coding, right? And that also goes for even tools like Cursor. Even if you have the code open in the middle of your Cursor window, I haven't used Cursor that much, but I have seen it before. If you have code open in the middle of your Cursor window, but you're primarily looking and interacting on the right-hand side, which is where the chat is in this example, then you're vibe coding. This is the definition of vibe coding I'm going to use, right? Another way I would define it, and I think Karpathy has also defined it this way, is instead of coding through something like Python or C++, there's an additional layer above the actual code, and you kind of have your LLM sitting there as a compiler. I'll actually draw this out. So you have like the user, and you have like Python, this for example, and then you have like kind of the interpreter, and then you have machine code. And so if you could imagine here, like, this is the usual kind of workflow you get. Like, the user writes Python, it's interpreted, and that is run on the machine, right? And so what vibe coding effectively is adding another layer here, that layer being an LLM. What you're writing here is English, right? So now you've got the English language as your programming language, and the LLM is kind of compiling it or interpreting it, however you want to put this. The LLM is compiling that code down to Python, and then Python runs on the interpreter. And naturally, there's flow in both directions here. In the same way that, you might run your Python, and then your interpreter raises some kind of exception. As an example, like, interpreter will communicate all the way back up the stack. Like, you have this flow up and down. Hopefully you're not getting an error all the way down to machine code. In that case, you mess something up, especially in Python. But the point I'm trying to get at here is you've got this loop going on at the top here, and this is the process of vibe coding as we're going to define it for the purposes of this video. So again, it's AI-assisted software development, but more specifically, you're kind of using the LLM as this compiler where you're just writing things in English, and then it is translating that into Python or C++ or whatever. And so, yeah, as opposed to writing Python or whatever language directly. I'm just gonna keep using Python as an example. So This is what I'm referring to as vibe coding here. Now, like I said, my main goal for this video is just to share with you guys kind of my perspective on it, how I do and don't use vibe coding to ultimately inform your own decisions about how you do or don't want to use it. And so before we get into my specific use cases where I do and don't, I just kind of want to outline the pros and the cons of vibe coding as I see them. And then that will naturally inform when I do and don't do it. The pros for vibe coding are honestly pretty straightforward. Increased productivity, AKA it's very fast. I have definitely found that whenever I use LLM tools like Claude, which I'll say is primarily what I use, Claude Code. And as an extension of increased productivity, you also get faster prototyping because, initially, if you were trying to think of a different way to implement the feature, but you're not certain it's something you do or don't want to do, if it requires a large investment of time and energy to actually prototype that out, you might not do it. Versus with vibe coding, you can just ask an LLM to code that out. You kind of get a feel of what that would or wouldn't look like. And then from there, you can move forward. To me, those are the main pros of vibe coding. They're pretty straightforward. And to me, they are very true. I mean, I will not deny that when I'm using AI tools, I'm a lot faster at development than I am when I'm not. And so now that we've gotten the main obvious pros out of the way, let's talk about the cons, which I think are a little less straightforward. For one, I do believe whenever you're using LLM tools, you're naturally going to learn less. And the reason I say this is because the best way to learn something 9 times out of 10 is to just do it. And with vibe coding, if you have the AI agent kind of doing this stuff for you, you're doing less yourself, and so you're learning less, right? Now, a common retort to that would be, I'm not having it write code, I'm having it teach me to write the code. And I understand that, as we'll talk about shortly, but in my opinion, that's not really vibe coding, that's learning with AI, which are two very different things. And so for the purposes of vibe coding, we're just sitting there and kind of typing out prompts for the LLM, not actually looking at the code we're writing. In that scenario, I do believe that you're going to learn less. And I've tried this, I've experimented with this in my own personal projects and even in small features for work, where it's like something that's new to me and I want to get it done, but I also want to learn. And the more I use AI tools to write code explicitly, the less learning I get out of it. And as a result, either I get less value out of whatever project I was doing, or if it's something I have to do repeatedly, it takes more repetitions of doing that thing to actually learn how to really do it, because I'm doing less of a percentage of each iteration. So yeah, less learning overall, which I'll just star this as, to be honest, to spoil the rest of this video, I think that's the main drawback of vibe coding and why I don't use it on large scale project for work. Yeah, this is the main drawback I see with vibe coding. But in addition to it, I've noticed that lots of times you get very bloated code that's kind of like not interpretable, not traceable. Because effectively you're not writing the code yourself. So if you sit and you write a line of code versus writing one line of prompt and then you get 25 lines of code, the ratio of how much code is in your program to how much code is, read, actually explicitly read and verified is correct by you, is going up and up and up. So ultimately, I haven't experienced this myself because I haven't really vibe coded that deeply to experience this, but I've heard stories where, like, let's say you've got the size of your repo in terms of lines of code, and up here you have interpretability of the code. How much the average software engineer can actually understand what's going on in that repo. For a not vibe coded repo, you'll have something like very small at the beginning, so it kind of like generally trends downwards, and maybe as that trend gets too much, you might like try to correct for it in some way, which maybe this is documentation, or this is like a refactor or something like this. Like you kind of get this, you're hovering around, you're doing okay, and the interpretability of your repo like ebbs and flows. Versus with, vibe coding, you might have something where you're at this kind of base low level of interpretability because you're not actually writing the code yourself. And then one day, this is the phenomenon I'm talking about explicitly here, one day like it just crashes. You wake up and you're like, oh my God, I don't even know the repo that we're working on here. Like this is effectively where things hit too high of a complexity and the LLM just can't handle it anymore. And so the whole thing collapses in under itself. And this is kind of what I'm getting at, where if the foundation of your repository or your project or whatever is all vibe coded, then it's going to look like you're doing okay, and you feel like tentatively okay that, all right, like things are working. I'm sifting through errors also with the help of ChatGPT or whatnot. And then eventually someday, the boogeyman comes to get you and it just crashes and burns. And suddenly you have to do this like mega refactor. And this is very, very ugly, right? These refactors do not go well. And so this code bloat phenomenon that I'm talking about here is really, really strong as far as I can tell with vibe coding, even though I haven't experienced it myself. Last point I want to talk about here is difficulties with interfacing. I'm using interfacing explicitly here. You could say system design as a different way of framing this, but to me, I'm talking about interfacing because I've found that if you ask LLMs for kind of a system level design concept for any given software project you're working on, if you ask LLMs for these kinds of high level decisions, they actually can make them pretty decently. And so I wouldn't classify them as bad at coming up with system level decisions. However, when it comes to actually implementing interfaces between these system components, I've found that these things really break down. Whether it's interfacing between two different packages or saving information or pulling information from certain locations, maybe externally. Difficulty with interfacing between different tools, I've found that it really struggles to do that, even if it's able to talk about doing those things somewhat intelligently on paper. And so overall, these are the pros and cons of vibe coding. I think the pros are very straightforward. They're also very true. Like I get a crap ton of stuff done when I'm able to leverage LLMs effectively, which is what we'll talk about in the next section here. I'm able to get a ton of stuff done, but there are certain risks with it that I think people underestimate, and it ultimately comes to bite them, as I drew in that diagram earlier, where things are going like, okay, and then one day the LLM can't handle it anymore, and because you haven't done any of the groundwork of actually implementing it, like everything just crashes and burns, right? Now let's talk about when I do or do not vibe code. I'm gonna eliminate one off the bat, which I think honestly is the main, if you take one thing away from this video, it's this one. And that's anytime I'm trying to learn, period. Anytime I'm trying to learn, I don't vibe code. And so obviously this includes personal projects I'm doing explicitly to learn about new tools or new concepts, and parts of work where, yes, obviously for work, there's this impetus that you actually get things done. But if it's something that I'm really going to need to know how it actually works at a deep level, which I would argue almost all code that you produce, you should be able to talk about at a deep level. In those scenarios where you really have to learn how it's going to work under the hood, vibe coding is not for you. And I find this with lots of new students or people fresh out of school where they're doing all these projects, but they're vibe coding the crap out of them, and they're not actually learning what they set out to learn by doing the project in the first place. The purpose of the project is to learn. And even if the purpose of a personal project you're doing is to get a job, part of getting that job will probably be speaking to the experiences of these projects in an interview. And so you better be prepared to do it, which ultimately requires learning how the things you build actually work. And so anytime the main goal, I'm gonna write mainly here, anytime the main goal is to learn, you just shouldn't vibe code by definition, because you're gonna be doing less yourself, and by extension, you're gonna be learning less. And so don't build a house on sand. Like, you really want a firm foundation, technical foundation, and you just cannot get that through vibe coding. Now, that's true, but learning with AI is very possible, and I think very useful. Just like in the same way that you learn with Google, you go on the internet and you read about certain topics or certain implementations of things to better understand what you're working on. Learning with these AI tools, they're really great at synthesizing all that information, presenting it to you in a way that's interpretable, and then opening up a conversation with you about that material. This, I would say, I do a lot more than just vibe coding. If this is how much I'm actually using AI, then this is how much I'm like vibe coding. Because there's lots of other things that you can use AI for. The main one I'm discussing here being learning. There's other things you can use it for, like I mentioned, prototyping here, docs, other stuff like that. Vibe coding is a very small share of this pie, and I think that learning is a much larger one, or at least should be, if you actually want to build these foundations and ultimately work from them going forward. This is the main point in which I wouldn't vibe code. What are the main points in which I would? Well, I would vibe code for, I'm gonna list them out here, for small deliverables with an understandable and interpretable IO, right, AKA objectives. Small deliverables with known IO, and ideally even a known solution. Like if it's something that I know how to do it, or I have a reasonable guess of how I'm gonna do it, either that guess is like available online, which is just practical perspective here because this is what these models are trained on, or it's something like I know personally, like this is something I've done before, and so I honestly I'm getting lazy and I don't want to do it again. The prototypical example I'm going to provide here is a button. If I'm doing some React stuff and this is TypeScript, I can reasonably track what an LLM is doing in terms of implementing this very small feature. I know what it's supposed to do. I know the context in which it's being used. It's very, very nuclear here, right? It's a very nuclear problem that I'm trying to solve, and I can constrain kind of the entropy that using an LLM naturally provides, and I can just constrain it to this small part. And this is kind of what I'm getting at here, which is two different ways of vibe coding, quote unquote. The one way is I open up like a fresh terminal. Did my power just go out? Okay, that was weird. But anyway, if it's a small thing that I can constrain the entropy that using an LLM naturally introduces, then that's a prime candidate for vibe coding. And this is what I'm getting at, where there's two ways in which somebody might vibe code. The first one is you're a non-technical founder at a YC company. You just kind of like open up a terminal and just go, right? It's not even a terminal. Well, maybe it's a CLI if it's Claude Code. But in other words, you're just like letting the thing go hog wild. This is something I would generally not recommend unless you're just trying to get a quick 500 grand from some VC guy, whatever. Versus if you're working on your code and there's a small like example of something that you know how to do, you know what you're trying to do, you know it's been done before, you know how to verify that it's been completed correctly. Like if you know all these things, I would say probably that last one being the most important. If you know all these things and you know that you can just pour the gasoline that LLMs are on that fire and get it done quicker, and just do it, right? I think that's a prime candidate for vibe coding, if you would even refer to it that way. And so this is kind of the line. This is where I draw this line for myself personally, where if you imagine like this is the spectrum here, and on one end you've got total vibes, and on the other hand you have like no AI. For me, I draw this line, this dividing line here is importance trends that way, size, if it's this way, it's like verification. If I can verify that the thing the LLM did is working properly easily, then that's a good place to use it. Also, availability of a solution, something that's been done a million times before, or that you've done many times before, and that might be a good candidate for just vibing through it instead of doing it from scratch all over again. Like this is kind of how I think about whether I should or shouldn't vibe code for any given piece of code I'm working on. So overall, I really just wanted to share with you guys my complicated feelings on vibe coding. Like I said in the beginning of the video, I kind of have mixed opinions about it. I'm sure that was made evident throughout the course of this talk, but as these tools evolve, who knows, like maybe my perspectives on it will change. Obviously, I'll be certain to share that with you guys as it does. But yeah, this is kind of how I think about when I should or should not vibe code as somebody who A, is involved in the industry and understands these tools at a technical level, but also has a healthy dose of pessimism about them overall. I don't think I'm gonna be losing my job anytime soon. If you see me begging for money on the street in a year, then clearly I was wrong. But yeah, overall, this is how I think about vibe coding. Thanks a lot for watching. Like I said, I'm the Unhinged Engineer. I make professional development content for other young engineers like myself. And if any of that content interests you, then this is definitely a channel for you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.